Welcome to EKO201E Economics. I'm Chris Hannum, and this will be lecture 13 on monopolistic competition. This will be the fourth of 5 lectures from this mini unit that we have on firm behavior and market structure. Previously, we discussed monopoly as another extreme case with only one firm and how outcomes with monopoly were different from the other extreme case, perfect competition. Now, for the remaining 2 lectures in this unit, we'll talk about 2 intermediate sorts of market structures. First, monopolistic competition, and second, oligopoly. These are both intermediate market structures. They're neither perfectly competitive nor monopolistic, with no competition. They have some competition. They're defined by very different characteristics. If we have a market that's an oligopoly, which we'll talk about in the next lecture, an oligopoly has a small number of sellers, and that's its defining characteristic. Only 2 or 3 sellers, not a large number, but also not one. And the defining characteristic of a small number of sellers results in a defining sort of decision that these businesses need to make that we classify as strategic behavior. That's factoring other specific businesses' decisions in when you decide what to do yourself. Now, monopolistically competitive markets, in contrast to oligopolies, could have a large number of firms, just like perfectly competitive markets could have a large number of firms. And monopolistically competitive markets can have free entry and exit, or relatively easy entry and exit, just like perfectly competitive markets. However, these firms all individually are monopolies in a more narrowly defined product. They all produce a special version of the product. So these products, this product differentiation among these products, causes the defining feature of a monopolistically competitive market to be product differentiation. And that product differentiation as a defining characteristic, it leads to one specific outcome which is very unlike any other market type, such as oligopoly, monopoly, perfectly competitive markets, and that's marketing and branding. So oligopolies naturally lead to, because of their special characteristics, naturally lead to strategic behavior. Monopolistically competitive markets naturally lead to marketing and branding. To describe again those basic characteristics of a monopolistically competitive market, a monopolistically competitive market should have or potentially have many sellers, it should have low barriers to entry, and it critically must have product differentiation. So one of those key features of a market, for that market to be classified as perfectly competitive, we said that that market has to have not just many buyers and many sellers, but identical products, so that one seller's tomatoes are the same as other sellers' tomatoes. If they don't, and each seller has a unique kind of tomato, that's what we mean by product differentiation. And if that one seller has a unique kind of tomato, some people might find that they prefer those tomatoes, and they're willing to pay more for those tomatoes. They could be loyal to a brand of tomatoes. And a lot of the products that we consume in our everyday lives fit into markets or market structures where the products are differentiated, market structures which are monopolistically competitive, such as apartments. Each apartment may be different from one another. Books, whereas each and every copy of War and Peace may be the same. War and Peace is not the same book as, for example, My Name is Red. Other products, which may seem inside basically identical, unlike a book, could be branded in such a way, marketed in such a way, packaged in such a way that the products seem to differentiate it even though they're really not, like bottled water. The water inside the bottle might be identical. We don't know for sure if it's identical, but we can see that the product is packaged in a different way. It's produced by a different company with a different name, and we have different advertisements advertising those brands of water. So bottled water also has product differentiation, and the market for bottled water is also monopolistically competitive, as is clothing, restaurant meals, nightclubs, movies, any other number of products that we consume every day. as we compare these different market structures, comparing perfectly competitive markets and monopolistically competitive markets to see in which ways they're the same and in which ways they're different. In terms of the number of sellers, both have many, so both in that regard are the same. In terms of free entry and exit, or easy entry and exit into that market, both have free entry and exit. Yes, both are the same. In terms of long-run economic profits, and we haven't yet gotten into how monopolistically competitive markets work and what the outcomes are, but because they're all, like perfectly competitive markets, because they all have free entry and exit, they'll have entry into the market chasing profits, and entry into the market which drives prices and profits down. So perfectly competitive markets and monopolistically competitive markets both have zero long-run economic profit. Both have the opportunity to earn a positive short-run economic profit. So where they differ, if they're identical in those respects, where they differ is whether the products these firms sell are the same, as in the case of perfect competition, or different, as in the case of monopolistic competition. They differ in whether the firm has market power, therefore the ability to control the price. Now, perfectly competitive firms have no market power, but monopolistically competitive firms do have market power. Last, the demand curve that faces an individual perfectly competitive firm is horizontal. So that firm can produce as much as they want or as little as they want, and they'll know that absolutely nothing they do can affect the price. That's not true for a monopolistically competitive firm. That's what we mean when we say a monopolistically competitive firm has market power. They face a downward sloping demand curve, and they know, like a true monopolist knows, that if they want to sell more, the only way they can do that is by lowering the price. If they sell less, they're willing to sacrifice some output and some sales, they will be able to raise the price, which is something that a perfectly competitive firm can't do. If we compare side by side a market or an industry which is a monopoly from a market or an industry which is monopolistically competitive to compare how they're similar and how they're different. Now, monopoly has only one seller, whereas a monopolistically competitive industry has many. In that respect, they're quite different. A monopoly does not have free entry and exit. They have barriers to entry. Whereas a monopolistically competitive industry does have free entry and exit, no barriers to entry. So in that respect, they're quite different. As far as long-run economic profits are concerned, because there's no entry into a monopoly, long-run economic profits can be positive. But for a monopolistically competitive industry, if there are short-run economic profits, this will lead to entry in the long run, driving those prices and profits down. So firms in monopolistically competitive industries can't earn long-run economic profits. In that respect, monopoly and monopolistic competition are quite different. However, as far as whether these firms have market power, monopolies do. They're able to charge a higher price if they want to charge a higher price. They're able to affect it. And monopolistically competitive firms do also have market power. They're able to increase the price if they would like to increase the price. Both monopolists and monopolistically competitive firms are limited in their ability to do this by demand, but both have some power to do it. As far as the demand curve they face, both monopolists and monopolistically competitive firms face downward sloping demand curves. And next, another key distinction to make. Monopolists, as we specified, do not have close substitutes for their products. Be a monopolist in an industry like electricity. Electricity does not have close substitutes. Monopolistically competitive firms do, because by definition, this is a narrowly defined good where there are many other versions of that good that we lump together all into a single market. For example, different brands producing different versions of smartphone, all of which are smartphones. So all of these firms are participants in the smartphone market, even though in the market for their individual version of that smartphone, each of these firms has a downward sloping demand curve, and each of these firms has market power. Now, to take a look at what profit would look like, how we would calculate it, what would determine it for a firm that's monopolistically competitive in the short run. Take a look at this slide. Monopolistically competitive firms in the short run can behave pretty much exactly like a monopoly can. Note, they face a downward sloping demand curve. They have market power. If they face a downward sloping demand curve, they have a marginal revenue curve which is underneath their demand curve. Marginal revenue is less than the price, because in order for them to sell more by increasing the quantity, they would be forced to lower their price to find somebody else to buy it, just like a monopolist would. For that monopolistically competitive firm, they'll choose the quantity of output in the short run here. Choose the quantity of output where marginal revenue and marginal cost are equal, and then they'll choose the maximum price, just like a monopolist would, that they're able to charge if they produce and sell that quantity of output. What's the highest price that the market will bear? And that's the price for that quantity on the demand curve, up above the marginal revenue curve at that same quantity. So in this example, this firm is able to charge a price higher than average total cost if they're producing at that quantity where marginal revenue and marginal cost are equal, charging a price that's higher than average total cost and marginal cost, earning a positive profit in the short run, just like a monopolist is doing. They're making their decisions in the same way that a monopolist would make their decisions, and the result is the same as the result would be if this industry was a monopoly. We see a positive profit, illustrated by that orange rectangle in your diagram. We could also imagine that, just as with a monopoly or with a perfectly competitive firm, we could imagine that demand for the product was quite weak, and as a result, that firm, by choosing the quantity where marginal cost and marginal revenue were equal, which was the profit maximizing quantity for them to produce, provided they don't shut down, provided they don't exit, because we're talking about the short run, where they could potentially have negative profits, such that they would choose to produce at this quantity, then they would choose the price which was the maximum price the market would bear if they were to produce that quantity, and it's possible that that price, even though the firm has market power, could be below average total cost. And if that price was below average total cost, the gap between those, that negative, that would be a per unit loss. And that rectangle that you see on the diagram represents their total losses with this very weak demand, therefore low market price for the product that they produce. Now, both of these could be possible in the short run. But in the long run, for a firm in an industry that's monopolistically competitive, we would expect those losses to lead to exit. And we would expect those positive profits to lead to entry. In the case of a true monopoly, that entry couldn't happen. So in our short run, our monopolistically competitive firms can behave exactly like a true monopoly would behave. They might not have quite the same ability to influence the price, not have the same ability to earn abnormally high profits as a true monopoly does, mainly because their demand would be likely to be more elastic. And the demand for a product produced by a true monopoly, because it has no close substitutes, might be more inelastic. But if we ignore that consideration, note that moving to the long run, the implications of a monopolistically competitive market structure are completely different than they are for one which is a true monopoly. In a monopolistically competitive market, as we move to the long run, if these firms are profitable, we have entry. And as we have entry, we have some new competitors, say, entering the smartphone market, producing another version of a smartphone, which isn't quite the same as a Samsung phone, or isn't quite the same as any individual version produced by Samsung, but which might take away some of the customers that would otherwise be buying Samsung phones. So that entry into the market, that reduces the demand for the products that this individual firm was producing that already existed in that market. So entry, rather than simply pushing down the price, reduces demand, takes customers away. exit from the market, if we imagine the second case, and each of these firms that's already in the market for that monopolistically competitive industry, if each of those firms is earning negative profits and some of them leave, then those people aren't going to be able to buy those versions of the product already, and they might switch to buying some of this firm's. So the demand for this firm's version would increase. Now, if Sony suddenly leaves the smartphone market, some of the customers that were previously buying Sony phones, they might switch to buying Samsung phones. And if they do that, the demand for Samsung phones will shift out. That's the natural tendency if we have negative profits being earned in a monopolistically competitive market, just as it would be if we had a perfectly competitive industry. On the perfectly competitive industry, when we have entry into that market, we model that as a shift in market supply. But here we're going to be modeling the impact of this. We said that shift in market supply for the individual firm in a perfectly competitive industry was observed as a reduction in the market price. That's what a decrease in demand for their version of the product would look like in a perfectly competitive industry. Here we're going to model this since we're not modeling the entire market for smartphones, but rather modeling the specific market for one company's version of a smartphone. We'll focus on the effect that this has, just like the decrease in that market price that a single firm in a perfectly competitive industry has, as reducing the demand for that version of the product in the firm level supply and demand diagram. So now what's going to happen as we reach some kind of a long-run equilibrium here? We said that in a perfectly competitive market, that long-run equilibrium had to be a point where there wouldn't be any economic profit. And in a perfectly competitive industry, we could only have that point where there was no economic profit, neither positive nor negative, when no firms wanted to enter, of course. No firms want to enter because of that zero economic profit. But where the price of the good was exactly equal to the long-run average total cost. And that happened to also be where marginal revenue and marginal cost were equal to long-run average total cost. Now, in the case of a monopolistically competitive industry, it also has to be the case for us to have a long-run equilibrium. So no firm wants to enter, no firm wants to exit. We have to have zero economic profit. We'll only have zero economic profit where price is equal to long-run average total cost. However, in this case, marginal revenue is not equal to the price, and marginal cost at that quantity is not going to be equal to long-run average total cost. So what has to happen here is that that quantity where marginal revenue and marginal cost are equal has to happen to be that point, which would give us a market price, which was the maximum price the market could bear, at that quantity where price was equal to long-run average total cost. And in this case, we're going to be shifting in that demand curve as more firms enter a profitable market. We're going to be, for example, shifting in the demand curve for Samsung phones as more firms enter that smartphone market. Every time a firm enters, that demand curve shifts in again. It will shift in and in and in and in until it just barely touches, it's just barely tangent to that average total cost curve. And once it does that, once it's just barely tangent, that will be the quantity and that will be the price where marginal revenue and marginal cost are equal and give us zero economic profit. Now, the same could also be true in the other direction. Suppose we had all the businesses in this industry earning negative profits and we're shifting demand out rather than in. And it would continue to shift out again until it was barely just touching that firm's average total cost curve. And it was just barely touching that average total cost curve. At that point, average total cost and price are equal. So at that point, that firm, and if all firms are equal, all firms are just barely breaking even. And at that point, There would be no more entry and no more exit into that market. Next thing to point out, we talked in the context of perfectly competitive markets about one crucial long-run outcome that we said was great about why markets are usually a great way to organize economic activity. And that was that in the long run, price would wind up being equal to minimum average total cost. And the marginal cost of producing at that quantity, you would happen to be producing at that quantity that minimized average total cost. As a result, all of these businesses in perfectly competitive markets are as efficient as they can possibly be. In monopolistically competitive industries, they're not. You can see in that illustration where this firm chooses to produce, the quantity that they choose to produce, and that's the quantity at which they're just barely breaking even. They have zero economic profit, just like perfectly competitive firms do. But that zero economic profit doesn't come along with producing at maximum efficiency. And they can't simply produce a larger quantity, therefore produce more efficiently, because there isn't anybody willing to buy or willing to pay enough to buy those goods that they might produce. So our firms in this monopolistically competitive industry, they wind up producing at a scale that's inefficient. They wind up charging a markup above their marginal cost as well, because they have market power. The price that they charge is always going to be higher than their marginal cost. So in theory, if they didn't have to lower the price that they charged everybody else, they could find some person who was willing to pay more than the marginal cost to produce the next unit, and they could cause their profits to increase, and they could cause welfare for all of society to increase by doing that. But they can't, but they wouldn't, because they don't want to lower the price that they're charging everyone else. And lowering the price that they charge everyone else, that price effect, outweighs, as it does for a real monopoly, the addition to profit that they would get from selling one more unit at a slightly lower price to somebody who isn't otherwise willing to buy it. Now, we define the first of those two undesirable qualities for monopolistically competitive industries as excess capacity. That is to say, if we described those differences in average total cost curves and the higher portion of that average total cost curve as being a point where we don't have quite the right size of facility in the context of our cost curves, back in lecture number 10. If we describe it that way, then here a firm which is monopolistically competitive, which is producing less than that efficient scale, given the size of their factory, that firm has a factory which is bigger than they actually need. They have excess productive capacity, which they're not using, or they're not using optimally. And monopolistically competitive industries will always have excess capacity. These firms will always have factories which are too big, or they'll always have retail outlets which are too big. And the reason that they'll always have factories that are too big or retail outlets that are too big is that if they were to have just the right size of factory, they would be profitable. And if they were all profitable, they would have more competition entering that industry, taking some of their customers away and forcing them once again to have a factory that was too large and to be inefficient. So we have excess capacity, meaning we have too big of a factory for the amount that we want to produce, and we're using more resources in order to produce these goods than we ideally need to use. It is not efficient, but it's unavoidable if the market is monopolistically competitive. What we also have is a markup over marginal cost. This is another term we use to describe the second efficiency problem that comes about because of monopolistically competitive industries. We have certain quantities of the good, because the price is greater than marginal cost, that should be produced but are not produced. Somebody is willing to pay higher than the marginal cost, and yet that good is not produced. The firm is not willing to produce it. Because of these two features, this excess capacity, which leads our costs to be too high, and this markup over marginal cost, which leads some units which should be produced, would maximize welfare to produce, are not produced, we say that monopolistic competition results in lower welfare than perfectly competitive markets. It is harmful in much the same way that a monopoly is harmful. It leads to efficiency losses or deadweight losses. If we produce up to that point where price is equal to marginal cost, we produce the socially efficient quantity. In a monopolistically competitive market, we don't. We produce less. Now, in contrast to a monopoly, it's very difficult for us to imagine an actual solution to the problem of monopolistic competition. First, we can't force there to be competition in this market because there already is. We can't force one firm to break up into many different parts. We can't remove barriers to entry. There aren't barriers to entry already. There are already potentially hundreds of firms making versions of this product. That lack of competition isn't the reason for these efficiency or deadweight losses. Also, we can't easily imagine how, because these firms are not profitable to begin with, we could use some form of regulation to regulate the price that they charge such that they could not mark up the price. If we force them to charge a lower price, given that there isn't sufficient demand for their products, all of these firms would lose money, all of these firms would require subsidies to stay in business, and we wouldn't be likely to have any efficiency gains. Now, to the extent that we can do something to minimize some problems from monopolistic competition, we might want to, for example, minimize the difference between products or minimize the ability of firms to engage in product differentiation. But again, in these cases, it's not easy to see whether this would result in a positive outcome or a negative one. Because while we have welfare losses because of these markups, units of output that are not produced, or efficiency losses because we have factories that are unnecessarily large, we also have improved product variety. Product variety, product differentiation causing product variety is one of these critical features of monopolistically competitive markets. And if it's the case that people actually prefer variety, most economists would argue that they do. Some contrarian economists would argue that too much variety could actually be a bad thing by making it too difficult to make decisions. If we have more variety, people might be more likely to be able to find just the right product for them. So imagine a market in which there was exactly only one kind of automobile. What are the chances that that kind of automobile is the exact automobile that you would prefer to buy if you could buy one today? I would think not very high. Chances are, if you can buy an automobile in today's monopolistically competitive automobile market, you're going to find something which best suits you and better suits you than that one automobile that you might get from a perfectly competitive automobile market. And if this is the case, that people actually like variety and they like variety so much, then we might actually be better off with markets that are monopolistically competitive than in perfectly competitive markets, in spite of the efficiency losses and in spite of these markups over marginal cost, leading to welfare losses and deadweight loss. We would also classify, as far as a relationship between monopolistic competition and welfare, that although we have a number of firms in the industry which is endogenously determined, such that we have a large number of firms, the number of firms is determined by whatever it takes for profits to be zero, whenever a new firm enters that industry, that new firm steals business from existing firms, creating what we call a business-stealing externality on other firms, which forces those other firms to become less efficient. That's what forces a firm which might otherwise have had just the right size of factory now to have a factory that's too big because some of their business has been stolen. They become less efficient because of the fact that some of their business has been stolen. And that external impact is obviously something that affects society, makes society less efficient, makes our economy less efficient, but isn't something that the business entering the market would consider. Likewise, they wouldn't tend to consider the fact that when they enter that market to try to earn some of the profits that are already being earned in that market, that they give a benefit to some people who are happier with their version of the product than they would have been with any existing version of that product. That benefit to those consumers is also external, so we'd call that a product variety externality. So if the product variety externality is greater than the business stealing externality, maybe monopolistically competitive markets are good. Also, as we mentioned at the beginning, while monopolistically competitive markets have variety and product differentiation, what distinguishes them in the real world from any other kind of market is the presence of advertising, branding, and marketing. Perfectly competitive firms have really no incentive to advertise because nobody can tell their product from anybody else's product. We could have one farmer who made a big advertisement, big expensive advertisement for tomatoes, and it could cause people to rush out and buy other farmers' tomatoes. So what's the point for that farmer? For a monopoly, say the monopoly produces electricity. Electricity doesn't have any close substitutes. So why would a monopoly for electricity advertise electricity to try to convince people to buy electricity? Everybody's going to buy electricity anyway. And people who buy electricity have no choice but to buy it from that company. There isn't very much to gain in either of those cases if a market is perfectly competitive or a market is a monopoly from advertising. And again, what advertising attempts to do is to spend money to make you want a product, to shift out demand for a particular product. Now, it's not very sensible for a perfectly competitive firm to do that. It's not very sensible for a monopoly to do that, because a perfectly competitive firm doesn't need to advertise to steal their competitors, steal customers from their competitors, and a monopoly doesn't have any customers to steal from. But it's very easy for a firm in a monopolistically competitive industry to, through advertising, shift out their demand curve at a relatively low cost by stealing customers from somebody else that makes a similar product, by convincing people that their product is maybe just a little bit better than that other competitor's product. So we see advertising and marketing and branding, which we'll get to in a second, as very, very common features specifically of monopolistically competitive markets. And they come about specifically because there are many close substitutes to this firm's version of the product. And because it is a unique version of the product, that firm is able to control all of the effects of the advertisement. They don't have a spillover benefit for everyone else producing that good, as a perfectly competitive farmer might. Now, economists, as they disagree about a great many things, don't come to any agreement about whether this advertising phenomena that comes along with monopolistically competitive markets has a good impact or a bad impact on society. We have certain critiques from economists of advertising, that is, reasons which economists argue that advertising is a net negative, and other reasons that other economists argue that advertising might in fact be beneficial. The first critique from economists about advertising comes from the fact that making advertisements and spreading advertisements costs money and it takes resources. So there are people working in these industries, there is capital that's employed in these industries, etc. And those people can't be working on something else. So those resources for society aren't used to produce goods and services. Those resources are used trying to shift demand curves for other goods and services. That's necessarily, from the perspective of society as a whole, a waste. So economists would argue that advertising is a wasteful use of resources in that it doesn't produce any tangible good or service. That is, provided you don't actually get any benefit from your consumption of Nike advertisements. Next, economists would argue that firms engage in this advertising in order to manipulate and change tastes. So they try to convince people to buy something or to convince people to want something by convincing people that their benefit to do so would be high when in fact it's not. So they want to convince people to have a higher willingness to pay for a product. But their marginal benefit, which should be equal to their willingness to pay, wouldn't change at all. So these people would be likely to buy the product and then be disappointed. They would have regret over buying that product, that the advertisement convinced them was worth buying, but in fact was not. And if we manipulate people's tastes in this way, we could wind up with transactions occurring that aren't welfare enhancing. It's a transaction that occurs where the marginal benefit to the consumer isn't actually greater than the marginal cost to produce. Consumers have just been tricked into believing that it is. And when they find out that it is not, they'll wish they could undo that purchase, but won't be able to undo that purchase. In this case, we could wind up with less efficient transactions occurring, therefore a reduction in overall surplus, a reduction in overall welfare in the economy. It's another critique of advertising. And the third critique, you might naturally not assume, is the critique that advertising can limit or impede competition. How? Well, suppose we have a market for automobiles, and that market for automobiles has 10 big global companies. And suppose that the automobiles that they make really aren't that different. If the automobiles that they make aren't that different, so we have one company making 6 different automobiles and another company making 6 different automobiles, and those 6 are interchangeable, there should be a great deal of competition between those two companies. People probably shouldn't be willing to pay a substantially higher price for one than the other because those products are really very similar. So they should be competing a lot. They should be highly competitive. They should have limited market power because those products are so similar. And one of the roles of advertising isn't just to convince people that their products are better. So if Ford engages in advertising for their cars, they're not just trying to convince you that their cars are better. They're trying to convince you that their cars are different than the cars made by other companies, that their cars are unique. And in fact, they may not be very unique at all. But if we have 10 companies, and each of these companies spends a lot of money on advertising, and their advertising convinces everyone that their products are very unique, it doesn't convince anyone that their products are better because all of those companies are simultaneously advertising. People start to believe that because those products are very unique, they must be willing to pay a higher price for one than the other. People may be more loyal to that company even if they raise their price beyond what they would otherwise have been able to do. And by convincing everybody that their products are unique through advertising, they limit the degree to which they are forced to compete with other companies by making their goods seem like less close substitutes for other companies' versions of that product. And that leads to higher prices overall in that monopolistically competitive market, as well as greater efficiency losses. Next, there are also economists, and as I've mentioned many times, economists don't agree about most things. There are economists who argue that advertising is actually good and that it may have benefits that outweigh those potential resource-wasting costs and things of that nature. Defenders of advertising chiefly argue one thing, that advertisements contain information. It's to say that if an advertisement contains information, it tells you something about a product that you wouldn't otherwise know. And if it's expensive for you, it requires effort, it requires time for you to learn all of the various things you would like to know about the economy. Where various things are being sold, what the characteristics of different products are, how much different places are charging for the same product. If all that knowledge requires effort for you to obtain, advertisements may be giving you valuable information for free. So in effect, it is a product that's being produced for your benefit. It's information. They would argue that so long as advertisements include relevant information, they're beneficial rather than being a negative. And as one case in point, there was one case study where they looked at an example with a ban on eyeglass advertisements. Because it's a medical product advertisements are often restricted by law. One area where eyeglass advertisements were banned and compared it to another area where eyeglass advertisements were allowed. So in those areas where eyeglass advertisements were banned, found that ultimately stores were charging higher rather than lower prices. And in those areas where eyeglass advertisements were allowed, firms could advertise their price and try to bring consumers to that particular area who otherwise would not have known that their price was low and that prices around the market fell as a result of allowing advertising in that market, rather than prices increasing due to some kind of a reduction in competition that might otherwise have been expected to occur. It may also be the case that advertisements that don't contain what you would think of as any useful, particularly relevant information, like the fact that a product exists or what the price of that product is going to be, could also contain relevant information for you, although they don't seem to. And a lot of advertisements that we actually see look exactly this way, such as advertisement for perfume, advertisements for athletic shoes. They often contain no meaningful information. You might just have an image of a basketball player jumping in the air wearing a pair of shoes. It's not clear what this is actually telling you about that shoe or its price or its features. No. But what many economists have argued is that if that advertisement is expensive, it may contain an important signal to you. And their theory is based on this idea that this company would imagine that if they produced a high-quality perfume or a high-quality athletic shoe, something that if they could convince you to buy, you would be very happy with. And not only would you be likely to buy more of their products in the future, because you're so happy with that wonderfully high-quality athletic shoe or wonderful perfume, but you would try to convince all of your friends that they should buy it too by bragging about how great it is. Now, the argument here in the theory is that it only makes sense for this firm to spend a lot of money on advertising this athletic shoe if they believe that to be the case, that you will buy more of their products and you will try to convince all of your friends to buy their products because when you buy it, you'll be so happy with it. So you should be able to assume that if they're willing to spend a high amount of money on that advertisement, that company thinks their product is so great that you will love it. And there'll be some other companies out there, and those other companies aren't very sure that they have a great product that you'll love. And those other companies that aren't sure there's a great product that you'll love, they think you might buy it and not really like it, and then tell all of your friends that it isn't that great and tell them they shouldn't buy it. And that company would see that it wasn't really very worthwhile to try to spend money on expensive advertising to convince you to buy it in the first place. Their benefit to getting you to buy it wouldn't be great enough. So as a result, this theory, economists argue, suggests that expensive advertisements should act as a signal of product quality. And even some advertisements that you wouldn't naturally assume contain any valuable information at all, in fact, do. And the last thing we want to mention in the context of monopolistic competition, not just advertising or marketing, but branding. Branding being something slightly different. Now, the brand for the firm is something which is fundamentally just a name, but it's a name that carries with it a reputation. If our market is monopolistically competitive rather than perfectly competitive, so the products are differentiated, people are very aware of which company's products they're buying. And if they're aware of which company's products they're buying, then they can attach their beliefs and everything they've learned about those products over time to the reputation of the company. And they can form expectations about what a product is likely to be like. If that's a new product, based on the reputation of the company that made it. This isn't the case for perfectly competitive firms. Monopolistic firms can have reputations, but their reputations aren't particularly relevant because they don't face any competition from anyone else who could have a better reputation. Now, if we look at branding for monopolistically competitive firms, firms might, for one thing, engage in advertising and marketing with the goal of building up their brand as advertising the company rather than advertising the product, or advertising the company through advertising the product. And if the company has this brand, and the company has this reputation over time because they have this brand over time itself becomes valuable. And the brand name itself is considered to be intangible capital. Some brand names for companies such as Coca-Cola are extraordinarily valuable, worth billions of dollars. And the effect of that brand, that reputation for Coca-Cola, comes through the ability to charge a higher price for Coca-Cola products than any of their competitors that don't have that reputation can charge. Next, if we have these brands and these long-term reputations, we have some other desirable features, even though we have the undesirable feature that people, when they respond to brands, become less price sensitive because they believe that branded products are more different than products that are not branded. The reputation of the business makes the product more unique. And when they do that, firms are able to raise their price, reduce efficiency, reduce welfare, etc. Just as through advertising expenditures we might expect to see. It has another effect, though, that firm which has a valuable brand wants to protect the value of the brand. So that firm has a disincentive to behave dishonestly and to try to convince you to buy bad products through advertising, which convinces you it has the product characteristic that it does not in fact have. And that company with a valuable long-term brand, with that reputation, that company has the incentive to spend money on research and development, on design, on improving their products to build up that brand over time. Because again, the most important thing that comes along with that brand from the perspective of that company is that when they produce a new product, say they enter a market they weren't in before, or they produce something completely new that nobody had produced before, people will be more inclined to buy it because of the reputation of their brand itself.